I'm Mike Gottlieb. For those of you who don't know me, I'm at Rush University Medical Center. I'm going to be leading this panel on how to operationalize research. In a second, I'm going to have everyone introduce themselves. But just to kind of situate what this is, it's meant to answer your questions. That's why panels exist, right? I have a whole bunch of pre-populated questions that I can ask, and I can fill up easily the entire time. But ultimately, it's about you all. Ask your questions at any point. Raise your hand. I'll pass along the mic, or I can paraphrase it for you. But it's about you all. What questions do you have? How do we figure out how to take all this amazing information we've learned so far, right? All the talks you've heard thus far and are going to, and the workshop that will follow this, and how do we actually operationalize this? How do we make it work? That's what this should be. So let's share our communal knowledge and figure out how we can actually get our research to be really successful. And with that, I'm going to pass along to our panelists to introduce themselves.
Hey everyone, hey, I'm Serena Dation. I'm one of the APDs at Duke, and my imposter syndrome is showing a little bit because much of what I've learned is from these amazing people around me. And so I definitely have some tips and tricks that are not my own, so I will not take credit for it, but have helped me to be really productive.
Hi everyone, I'm Jamie Jordan, one of the APDs at UCLA, and very happy to be here and see you all.
Hi, I'm Teresa Chan. I'm at McMaster University, and I am an education scientist within the McMaster Education Research Innovation and Theory Unit, MERIT. It's much easier to call it MERIT. And I'm the Associate Dean of Continuing Professional Development at my university.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Mitzman. I am at The Ohio State University and Nationwide Children's Hospital, where I'm the Associate Program Director for one of the largest pediatric emergency medicine fellowships in the country.
All right, so this is our group. Now, I'm going to start with the first question, and then following that, I really want anyone to just like raise questions, ask away. But the first one I think is important to kind of situate this in the first place and say, all right, so we're talking about how we operationalize research. Well, first of all, how do you pick a project? How do you decide what's a viable project? How should I decide what to do? When do I invest my time into it?
Probably the first place is like, what are you passionate about? I think that goes without saying because it takes a while for a project to go from idea to actually like publication, right? And so you really need to have that interest and passion in that area. Otherwise, it will die on the flame, right? It will not exist. And so really, and also asking like, what does your community need to answer, right? What is the questions that are unanswered that are out there? A great way to kind of build on this, if you find your area of interest, you can always look at the publications in that space and look at the limitations area, and they actually will help you to decide what's the next project to do, right? So you can kind of learn from those projects that already exist, but really I think it starts with your passion and then moves on.
I will just add, in addition to looking to your passions, also be an opportunist. And if there are any changes happening at your shop, if there are any problems that you encounter that you want to know more about, I think those are also great opportunities to take advantage of and do a project on.
I think a big part of it is also to start thinking about how you can be also programmatic, even though you want to see what's trendy and things like that. I think it's important for you to leverage that when you're doing a review for one paper, for you to then completely, on your next paper, do a different domain and have to learn a whole new body of literature is a little ridiculous, even though I've done it a bunch of times. I just learn from my mistake and just stick in a domain for a while till you're like really done with it and then move on. Like, I don't do as I've done, do as I say is definitely what I'm doing here right now. But I would say that it's a heavy lift each time you have to learn a new body of literature because you're often, especially in med ed and health professions education, learning from other adjunctive fields like business and main K through 12 education and higher education. And so as you have all of that in your memory banks, then it's a lot to redo that. So when you're first starting out, stick to an area for a little while until you're like, okay, I think I've done everything I can here, and then move on to do that next scoping review to, hardline your next program of research.
Yeah, and I would say think big, but start small is the other piece of advice I would have. So, thinking about things from a big picture, whether it's, the problem you've identified, whether it's, something you're trying to improve, but then also recognizing that you got to start with a manageable bite of that problem, and you're not going to solve all of it in one project or one foul swoop, most likely. So kind of having that big vision, but also not being afraid to recognize that it starts with a small step forward.
I think there was so many pearls packed into that, everything from finding your passion to figuring out the relevance to it. And particularly one of the ones that resonates with me is try to avoid these one-offs. Try not to treat it like the ED. When we're in the emergency department, we jump from a chest pain to abdominal pain to a dermatologic complaint, and you're like going through thing to thing to thing, and they're very different. And the reason we've gone through so much training is that becomes easier, right? Because we've seen all this stuff. We've gone through all this training. But when you're doing it in research, that's like having that same experience, but now throwing in an M1 because they haven't done 8 years in each of these wide range of areas. It's a lot of cognitively taxing activity. It's way easier if you find one thing you're really good at and start to carry that project forward and then carry it to the next one. Learn the skill set. Use that project to now learn different ways of approaching that problem. But the more that we jump from very disparate projects, it's just a lot of, it's taxing and it's exhausting. It's a lot of work. And I don't think that you're probably doing a service to the project either, because now you have this expertise in an area and you're saying, I've now developed expertise in this, I'm now going to move to another study and not share further expertise and the ability to extend that niche. Do y'all have any questions?
Okay, so yeah, it's a lot of work. I hear you. But if I look at you five, and I look at the new AEM, ENT articles that come out, the new WestGem articles, oh my God, your name comes up every freaking month. How are you guys publishing just rapid fire back to back? How do you have this time? How do you fit into your schedule? I'm barely able to do like 2 or 3 a year. So what's your magic?
That's a great question. What's the secret sauce?
What's in the secret sauce?
Oh, okay. So I think Shree's the one that brought up, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. But in research, it's reversed. If you want to go fast, go together. If you want to go far, you might have to go it alone. That's the African proverb that I'm reversing right now. And I know I'm flying in the face of lots of culture and expertise, but there's a difference in research because what you want to do is you want to function as a team. And my analogy for the armed med crew the other day was, it's like Canadian geese. Have you ever watched Canadian geese fly in a documentary, if not in real life? You'll see the lead goose doesn't stay the lead goose for very long because it's exhausting. And breaking the headwinds and doing the heavy lift so that everyone else can coast a little bit. Well, if you only are always lead goose, guess what? You're going to only be able to fly 2 short flights, right? But if Gottlieb's the lead goose sometimes, and then I take and coast off of his trailing winds, and then Shree takes the lead, and then Jamie takes the lead, and then, and I think you've taken the lead at times. I was like, have I written with her? Yes, I have. Okay. That was what the cognitive load was high. And I was like, and I'm just wondering if, we don't make that as explicit, but there's a reason why there's an authorship author list. And there are positions that basically people are vying for. Sometimes you're first author, sometimes you're last author, sometimes you're second author, and sometimes you're somewhere in the middle, and you quite frankly don't care if you're between 3 and 7, because it's not going to make a difference for promotion committees, and it's not going to make a difference really in terms of the terms of reference of your role. But if you're always first author on everything, Thanos had a really hard time, conquering the universe. He did it, I guess, eventually. But, imagine, he actually had people he could trust to send around for the 5 different stones. And it would have been a lot easier. I felt like he probably went really slowly with those stones because he didn't have a pack of Avengers. I'm not sure that that's the best, analogy necessarily, but his command and control structure makes it really hard for him to effectively team. And if you compare that to the Avengers, where it's a loose association, and sometimes there's 2 Avengers in the movie, sometimes there's 3, and sometimes there's all of them, well, there's still going to be someone that's kind of the lead character. So I'm just pointing out that I think the way that we've been taught to do research may not always be the most effective way to be prolific at research. But you just have to make sure that you're still adhering to the ICMG criteria, that you're still actually putting it out there, that you're going to do your due diligence in your work and to step back when you haven't done enough. All of those things still need to come to bear.
I totally agree with the making friends and rotating roles idea. The other thing that I found helpful is timing, right? Having multiple projects at various stages of development, because they all require different amounts of energy, time, and honestly, like just cognitive load, right? So if you have a lot of things that are in various stages from, idea conception to data collection to manuscript writing, like that all seems to flow very smoothly without overwhelming you, versus if you get bolus and now all of a sudden you're trying to get like 5 IRBs through and collect data all at the same time, it's really hard and it's going to take you longer. So that would be my other piece of advice.
And then also just with the way that you collaborate as well, like we're big Google Drive people as well. We have no stock in there, I promise, but it makes it really easy to tag your friends, right, on the parts that they're not doing. It sends an email automatically to their inbox, so you don't have to do that and remind them about it. So it makes it a whole lot easier to tag them to the part of the like manuscript that they're in charge of. Even creating like a folder of like research articles that they're supposed to look at and things like that. So you can really streamline the actual work that it requires by using some of these tools.
And I think a lot of it has to just be with the teams. I'll echo fully what's been said, is that you have effective teams, and then it's less on each person. I write very infrequently as a solo author because it's not as fun, first of all. It's way more fun to work as a team. But it's not really about us, right? It's about how do we build the next generations? How do we create that sustainability? And my goal for most teams is that I eventually float off, and they can run on their own without me. That's the intention, right? But I think along the way, the reason that you're seeing like a lot of us on these papers is because we're building these teams out and then we're stepping back and they're running with that. And that's kind of the intention of a lot of this, is how do you build that next generation? Because it's not, if we rely on only a small number of people to do all the publications, that tires out really quickly, and that's a finite resource. That's not the purpose of it, and that's how we get really closed viewpoints and missed opportunities. So I think it's build our teams, and I'm surrounded by some of my favorite team members and really grateful for that. And that's probably the only reason I get to publish, is I get to work with really amazing people.
One other thing is to normalize that when you're junior, it might only be 2 papers or 3 papers a year. Because just like a good junior resident, maybe 2 or 3 patients an hour is actually good enough, right? Like 1 patient an hour is good enough actually for most junior residents. But as you get more familiar with the methods, as you become more expert in the domain, as you become the person that wrote half of the papers in a domain, guess what? The process is less hard, for the same reason that seeing chest pains when you were an M1 was excruciating. Like, have you ever observed an M1 do a complete beginning to end chest pain in history and physical now? You're like, oh my goodness. And you're just like, checking Twitter, and you're like behind the curtain, and you're like, oh my gosh, it's so inefficient. And right now, when I mentor junior people, my job is to give them that direct observation, feedback on how to be more efficient as an investigator. That's the role in my mind as a last author, is to be the Alfred to your Batman, so that you can, I know DC Comics now instead of Marvel, but the idea is to facilitate them being amazing. And I think that you have to be patient with yourself and compassionate with yourself. But along the way, if you can inspire other people to follow suit, to actually take up the mantle and learn how to be Robin so that later they can be Nightwing, that's really important. And so build up the people that come after you. Because your best collaborator may not be in your cohort. They might not be your mentor. They might be someone who, like you sit next to at a conference one day. Look around you right now. And maybe your best collaborator yet, you just don't know it because you haven't met them, right? And then that's the Michael Bublé, shout out there. Okay.
I was just going to mention also, I think for me, and I sometimes still feel this way, is, it's hard to know what the steps are to actually get to that publication itself. So there's a lot of great articles. I want to plug Teresa's work. She has a lot of like how to do qualitative research or quantitative research and all of this, scoping reviews. And so there's a lot of great guides out there that even talk about like the grading system for it or the scoring system for it to make it high quality and very rigorous. So if you have that as your template when you come up with the idea, it can really help to guide you. and then also ask a lot of questions along the way, which Mike and Teresa know I ask a lot of questions like, how do we do this? What, am I doing this right? And trying to get feedback. And I actually make my own how-to guides so that when I'm growing the next generation to take after me, I'm actually handing them off. Like I do a lot of best practice papers with our committee. And so I actually have like, here's step 1, here's step 2, and I'll go back and revise it each time we do a best practice paper because there's something I missed in that step that made it really painful that I will now fix so that they don't have to have that growing pain that I had to go through. So that's a great way to pay forward for the next person who's going to take over for you.
So what's your day-to-day trick to writing, making time? How do you do that?
So everyone on this group knows that I like live and die by my calendar. If it's not on the calendar, it's not happening. And if it's not happening, it's not ever making it on the calendar. So you have to be, it's okay to have boundaries, but when you decide you're going to do something, so I schedule, like literally put onto my calendar an appointment with myself for writing. I schedule that time at a time that isn't going to be in conflict and that works with so I'm a morning person, right? So that might mean like that appointment, I know it's going to make people cringe, but like maybe it's at 5:30 or 6 and my husband puts my kids on the bus and, because that's a time of day that I'm really focused. I realize some people are night owls, that's fine. So I make an appointment, I do it, I schedule it regularly. And then in terms of like the actual writing part, I have found really good success with the Pomodoro Method, which is basically, you set an uninterrupted timer for 25 minutes. You take a 3 to 5 minute break, right? It's not like get on your phone or Facebook or like send 50 emails. It is 3 minutes, get a drink of water, stand up from your desk. And I do that 4 times for that kind of writing block. And I just commit that time is going to be, for whatever project I've sort of scheduled for that day. So it doesn't just happen for sure. You have to really be intentional about the timing, I think.
I'll just say I'm also a big fan of scheduling, but I need more time. I can't write in little bits, so I actually have to block out 4-hour windows for me to do any sort of effective writing. And the other thing is I outline everything, and I found out if I can just start with an outline, which seems much less intimidating than writing a whole manuscript, then I can populate those things really quickly.
I will also echo that scheduling. So I schedule so hard that I put the Google Doc link instead of a Zoom link into the calendar, so I ain't going anywhere other than that link. Because once I go into the dark hole of email, it's forever, like I'm gone. It's like that time's gone. And so to decrease distraction, I basically can turn off the internet. Not really, but I have to, because I use Google Docs. So, but I don't have to open my email in order to get that link, and I don't have to go into my Google Drive and get distracted by 7 other things. I just know that is the link that I should click on to go to that article. The other thing would be that I actually distribute writing a lot more now as a senior author. I do not do a lot of first shot, only shot stuff unless it's like your graduate studies. Unless you're getting credit for your thesis, probably I think we should stop writing like it's 1990 and making the first author do their first draft, right? We don't have to print it out and mail it around to co-authors anymore. And so why not use the cloud to actually, you're laughing, but like honestly, it's not like in Einstein's day where his wife actually like helped him write the manuscript and then he mailed it to people for peer review. So I think if we write collaboratively, the many hands make work lighter. And also, if you use Google Docs correctly, you'll get a whole bunch of peer pressure to write that article because she's already written her part and Mike's written his part and Jen's written her part. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I have to write that part. And that helps. But outlining then is actually imperative because if you don't have a solid outline, the story won't come together well. So outlining first and being really clear about it. And I do the Pomodoro technique, but I only have 20-minute chunks now in my life because that's the way I roll. So if I have a great outline, like Jamie pointed out, I have 20 minutes, I'll schedule it, and I'll write that one paragraph. That's all I have time for, and I'll come back to it later.
Yeah, and I'll just echo, there's also a technique like the 1-3-5 method where it's like if you had to make a priority list of everything you have to do. My to-do list used to have like 20 things on that day that I would need to get done, right? And inevitably to, do the least helpful thing on that list just to check things off, right? So instead, go ahead and brainstorm the night before. What's the list of things that you want to get done the next day? But then use the 1-3-5 method. So what's the one thing that if you took off that list would actually advance you or advance the world, right, a little bit further, right? And that'll be the first thing you prioritize because you have the most mental energy for that. And then the next is the 3. Choose the next 3 things on that list, and then the last 5 things. So even if you got that one thing done, it's a good day. You've won, right? And if you finish that, go ahead and move down to the 3s, right? And then do the 5s. So it really helps to prioritize things. 'Cause otherwise, everything's grabbing for your attention, so it gets challenging.
I think that we also have some rituals and hang-ups around our writing. Like the imposter syndrome creeps in about whether or not something is good enough, and you start editing your own work. And so I have a policy that I try to enforce, but don't always, but try to just keep writing. Like you want to be like Dory, the fish from Finding Nemo. Just keep swimming. Just keep writing. If you have done it right, you've draft picked some people that are really good editors to be on your team of Avengers. Those people can't use their superpower unless there's word on a page. My superpower is that I get words on a page. They may not make sense, but that's not the point. Because someone else will read that sentence, know what I was getting at, and then write a beautiful sentence that replaces it. And I don't care, because we are a team, and it doesn't matter because we will win together. Oh, sorry, did you? Okay.
I think those are so many great pearls built into that. Everything from the concept of block off the time, because if you don't block it off, it's not going to happen. And I would propose that when you're blocking it off, figure out the time that matters to you, not the last available time. The last available time is the time that didn't work for anyone else. That's the 6 to 8 p.m. on a Friday night. That's not probably going to work for you either. And that's the first one that get kicked off that list, right? If you figure out that you work best at 5 to 6 a.m., awesome. Then you block that time off and there'll probably be no competition. But if your best time is actually 7 to 9 a.m. on Mondays and Wednesdays, that's apparently when it's like the best time for you, block that off. Trust me, that meeting could go another couple days later, no one will care. It's not a big deal. But if you leave that block open and you don't actually block it off your calendar, that'll be the first time they'll fill up, and you'll be at your best cognitive capacity to sit and nod in the meeting and give 2 thumbs up, right? It's not the best use of our skills. We should be utilizing our best times to write or to do things that are cognitive testing, even if it's just brainstorming the next project. And then the other aspect of it is just remove your distractions. I think the groups brought up a lot of really great components of that. Whether it be with Pomodoro or with just functional, like 4 hours blocked off or whatever your system is, just block it off, meaning no email. Seriously, that email is not important. Close off any of those things. Avoid the temptation to try to spell check. I have personally had that experience where I'm like, there's a better word for this. I can't think of it right now. I'm going to think of it. Is it community? No, I don't like that word. Is it environment? Let me go look on thesaurus.com. Okay, I look on thesaurus.com. No, nothing there. Okay, let me go through 7 other dictionary sites. And at the end of it, I've wasted like 4 hours. I found the most perfect word. And then it goes to review, and the reviewer's like, I don't like that word. Use this one. And it all ends up being community. So, like, at the end of it, it's not really worth it. That time you spend focusing on spelling grammar, there are a ton of people who will love to copy edit for you. You got to get the words on paper. Use the time wisely. And I think that was a question that was going on.
Or maybe just maybe you're not the workshop writer, and maybe you should know that you're not, and then find your workshop writers. Because some people are not. Maybe not your superpower. Just know yourself well enough to tap out and say, I am really good at leading, and I'm a really good editor. I think some people fill the middle, and perhaps get back to you.
So I wanted to know if you guys could talk a little bit about more your like granular process. Sometimes I find myself, I'm doing a good job of scheduling my time, but then I open up my computer and I'm like, all right, I have 3 different projects that I'm working on. What's the first thing? And then I spend my time, either opening up the Google Doc or trying to remind myself where I was in my writing process. How do you guys maximize the time that you have? If, just like you're saying, you have like maybe 20-minute increments. How do you maximize the amount of time to get the words on the paper rather than spinning your wheels and remembering where you are and prioritizing your different projects?
That's what the night before is for, instead of being on Twitter and Instagram, which will keep you awake till 1 a.m. probably is like if you're able to just think about it the night before you're about to do the work, you could, because your mental bandwidth is already not great at that point, but at least you're getting something productive done. It's just that, and actually I put it in the calendar, like on this project, this is exactly, specifically what I want to work on, so that it's very clear. I'm not going to actually look at anything else, but this is a little task I need to do. If I'm finished with that, I usually have a backup. Like after that, what's the backup for that project if I have any time left over to do that? But then it makes it, then when it's go time, it's go time. I don't have to think about what I need to do on that project. It's already kind of pre-decided the night before. Yeah.
Yeah, I will just say in sort of overall prioritization when it comes to research, you could think about it like you do in the ED, and that's the disposition, right? That's what you want to focus on. If there's a disposition that can be made, like make that. And so if there's a manuscript that can be submitted or revisions that can be completed and resubmitted, like focus on that as your priority. And then for like the granular stuff, I'm super anal, and for all of my projects, I create like a work breakdown structure of every single thing that needs to get done with like my own little internal like deadlines. And as I go through each project, I sort of tick them off in the Excel spreadsheet that I created. But it's a little much, but then it unburdens my cognitive thinking for actually like ideas and writing and generation, all of that.
And also, I think to Teresa's point, maybe for that, sometimes if you're really, really struggling, like that's a project where you're not the first writer, right? So I think that we have to like own the fact that for certain projects, or maybe just in general, like she said, you may be the greatest editor of like tightening those ideas, like word ninjaing 500 words out of that manuscript that don't need to be there, or finding the perfect word. And so if you're like on a project where you're really struggling, sometimes it's you have the big picture and you would be great at editing, and so you have to have the right team mechanics, and you have to be able to like know enough about yourself to say that's actually what I'm really good at, to make sure this project gets across the finish line. But this part gets assigned to this person, that part gets assigned to that person, and it's okay, and you can be successful with that role.
Yeah, knowing your role and knowing your talents, those are really important things for teaming, right? If you're the RT, you probably shouldn't be putting in the central line, right? And so if you know what your skill set is, what your expertise is, then you should do that part. And so I think that sometimes when there's role confusion with the team, then it's probably time for the team meeting. I like to have no team meetings. A successful project for me is we have one team meeting, we all decide to do it, and we never talk again. It's all Google Docs, okay? Because it's just wasted time. Team meetings, unless you have and sometimes we have to call a team meeting because someone's like, I don't know my role. And that's the reason to call a team meeting. But everything else, you can probably sort it out using the dialogue boxes, and I think people actually waste a lot of time on meeting. I know. But I mean, the ideal situation is that you have that plan of attack, and you minimize the amount of like crosstalk. I love certain kinds of papers because they have that outlined. There are conceptual papers where the hard work is the discussions, where you're doing qualitative analysis, and you look forward to those team meetings for a different reason. But when it comes to writing time needs to be writing time. If you're prioritizing during writing time, again, you're getting distracted. So the prioritizing that Shree's talking about the night before, I usually round out all my projects on Monday. I send the annoying emails of the last author, the first author, hey Mike, how's it going? Am I missing something on this project, or am I still waiting? And I check in with the people that I'm, supposed to be accountable to support them. I take care of the first author stuff. My first author pile is always the smallest, and it should be, because that I have agency to do. I know exactly what's next, and like Jamie, in either a mental checklist or an actual to-do list is there on the thing, and I just check off the next box. And then the middle author stuff, again, if I haven't heard from someone in about 2 months, I might check in on that one, but that one is, like I am waiting for someone to tell me what to do on those ones, and I'll let them drive it at their own pace, because that's not my role. My role is not to be the boss on that one, and I'm trying to be a good follower, and that helps me then clarify what my priorities are, because then I'm going to be responsive to my trainees or the junior faculty that I'm mentoring. They go first, just like in the ED, right? The med student's patient who's kind of sick needs to be seen first, and then my patients that I've been seeing behind all the residents back, because that's how we roll in Canada, Like, I'm going to go take care of them because no one else is going to take care of them, right? While everyone else is reassessing things. And then number 3 is that if there's another doc who's taking care of other patients, wants me to help them with a sedation or a resuscitation, they will call me when they need me. And it's the same skill set. I'm just doing it more over months rather than hours.
I was wondering if you guys have any advice around choosing meaningful outcomes for med ed research. So for example, if I'm designing a curriculum, the easiest thing, but probably the most useless thing is to do a pre-post survey, but that's, I mean, it's done and it's maybe not completely useless, but not the highest level of evidence. But then if you try to link it to patient outcome, then it becomes so tricky because then so many confounders. So do you have any advice around program evaluation?
I mean, I'll just say that higher on that Kirkpatrick level is always better, just not always feasible. And I think the most important thing is just to make sure that the outcomes that you're seeking to measure are aligned with your research question. So depending on the question, that's really going to lead to what outcomes you're looking at.
Kirkpatrick is the king in the literature for sure, but not the only game in town. And so I think that it's worthwhile studying other program evaluation strategies and theories so that you diversify the portfolio of things, because sometimes it's better to do a realist evaluation so you can understand how the same mechanisms can yield completely divergent outcomes and actually map out the outcomes, which is a much more constructivist lens, right? It might be that you need to do a logic model because you had a program theory that now you need to just understand how things map. And if these terms are new to you, we have, I think, Education Theory Made Practical book chapters on each of these to help you conceptualize them. So just go to alium.com/library and there's 5 books there. We're working on 6 and 7 already. Oh my God. And the idea would be that these are strategies that will actually help you to diversify the way you think about program evaluation, because it is a vast science that we have only just touched upon in health professions education, and we don't do it justice, but other places, other fields have done it much more, and even health services implementation science can be very inspiring to look at how they think about program evaluation, because if no one shows up to your clinic, it doesn't matter how good the outcomes were in your optimal study, because you still need to understand the barriers to adoption when it actually gets deployed in real life. And so yes, some Kirkpatrick has to be done. But Kirkpatrick studies usually tend to be very ideal state studies and are limited by when rubber meets the road and you have a pandemic going, can you still do that same intervention and get the same outcomes as someone else who did it in a different circumstance at a different time? And that contextual variation is actually really important to report and be able to be loyal to.
And then,
Program evaluation is a discipline in and of itself, even that crosses professions. And Kirkpatrick happens to be out of the program evaluation literature, but was designed for vocational education, which is really interesting that in medical education we've glommed on to Kirkpatrick. And so, to reinforce what you just said, there are so many other ways to do program evaluation. And they range from very, 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 very qualitative connoisseurship to very, 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 very quantitative long-term outcome measures. And you can pick the one that works best for your situation.
and also like just to learn from each other, right? If there's a topic area that you wanted to teach, for example, there's publications on that, right? So pulling up those articles, reading their methods sections, reading, maybe some of the limitations, then you can actually build your own study to be more powerful and, and address some of those limitations. So if you have like your area of interest, you can really look at the literature that's already out there and ask yourself, how is your project going to be different, or answer a question or add to the conversation is probably the first thing. But then learn from the methods that they've done that, they got published, so they did something right. So learn from their methods and limitations so that you can make yours much more rigorous, right, and grow the literature.
Really, really, we tend to do what we know. We choose the methodology we're familiar with. We've spent all of medical school and residency learning about randomized controlled trials, and that as if that is the model. We can't do randomized controlled trials for programs, and even if we did, they probably wouldn't capture the complexity of the system, right? It's not this discrete thing where I change one thing and one thing changes. There are so many, they call it an open system effectively. There's so many things that enter into the system that challenge this, that change this, that it's a little disingenuous. And so when we try to apply things that were used in the basic sciences into a less controlled environment like this, we're setting ourselves up to miss things. So, and your point was totally valid. That was, there's always confounders in there because it was never really intended to assess that way. Maybe a component of the program evaluation, but there's so much more to it. And I think when we anchor on just Kirkpatrick and we try to do this one piece, we miss so much of the bigger picture that we miss the opportunity to inform people when they're trying to build this curriculum out.
There's also more to education scholarship than research. And the program evaluation is a classic example of that. It's a whole science unto itself. And so if it's not research, don't try to sell it as that, because if you try to, then most of the people in the room are savvy to that now. And they'll tell you, this is a program evaluation study. And so you'll get that as a review, right? So if you were truly trying to discover something new and it's discovery scholarship, then yes, of course, it's research. There are some things that are in the gray zone, like participatory action research and other things like that. I am not an expert in it, but I know that it is in that straddle zone, especially with implementation scientists. They have some areas that are kind of bordering what we would consider maybe program evaluation, but it comes then down to the positionality of you and whether or not you had influence on the curriculum, or you had to beg someone to and win a big grant to be able to do the curriculum. It'll come down to some of those kind of things. So there's some nuance there. It also affects your IRB process. So knowing which and where you're going to do this curriculum come hell or high water, and you happen to want to then do some evaluation science on it to make sure it worked. That is one stream of doing things. Another would be, I won this giant NIH grant. I'm going to deploy a multi-center trial to make sure there's, Duke and Rush and UCLA, yeah, and it's just, right, and all those things, right, and I guess you're PEM, so maybe we wouldn't, we might not have you in the first run. That study will be, something that you may want to do something different, right? And so understanding why you did the stuff that you did and what you were building towards is really important for those outcomes. And then figuring out how to position the work that you do as scholarship is important. And there's other things like innovation reports where if you're mainly doing curriculum but it's a really innovative model, why not write it up as an innovation report, which means that you don't even need sometimes evaluation data, even for top journals like academic medicine. You don't have to have evaluation stuff as long as you really explain how the conceptual frameworks and theories actually help with a judicious innovation creation, right? And there's so many different kinds of scholarship now that depending on how you're promoted, you don't always have to do it as research. And I think that's important as well.
Like to teach and we like to design curriculum and deliver that, but then we're kind of asked by the university to turn that into a deliverable. So that's kind of where I'm struggling. And so I think your point about the innovation report is something I'm definitely going to look into. Sorry? But is it maybe not counted as highly as an academic currency?
It's interesting. I was going to say it's interesting too, because I think the best thing that you can do for yourself is figure out what counts and what's valued at your institution. That's the other thing, is what's valued in one place might not be valued in another. And I think the essence of what we have to do as medical educators is show that the teaching and all the work that we do has an impact or is meaningful. And the obvious way to do that is sort of be like, I do this and here's the publication for it. But I think to your earlier question of the outcomes, my response back to you would be who, when, and under what conditions, right? Because you use the sort of survey example of probably not a great outcome if you're trying to do research, and research is about generalizable and transferable, knowledge, right? but maybe hugely important to you as a program director, you know, trying to make changes and stuff within your program, right? And so I think hearing the conversation about like sort of research and program evaluation, you gotta really think about what is the purpose, why are you doing this? And sometimes if it is just for the line on your CV to get promoted, then there's could even be a different strategy to that altogether, right? But I think, you know, the outcomes that I think about are like, well, what is this going to do? Am I trying to advance the field? Am I trying to improve my program? That sort of thing.
Yeah, going along with this kind of line of trying to differentiate research from program evaluation, I guess, and this might be obvious, but if you guys could explain to me, when we're thinking about getting IRB approval, I mean, I know if I'm doing a research project, you definitely need to submit, but I'm a little more confused if I'm just like looking at a survey, or how do you identify like what kinds of things you need to like bring to the IRB for?
So most academic institutions have a determination of research form or like online resource or what have you, and so you can identify that resource, and if you don't know where it is, you can call the Office of Research or email them and ask. But most institutions should have a determination of research, and essentially the level before deciding whether it's exempt, expedited, or needs a full review is a determination by your institution of whether it constitutes research at all in the first place. And so there may be, you know, and that can vary by institution because it includes things like, you know, whether a patient could be identifiable, for example, and someone might consider a case report to be research, and some institutions say that's not research because there's not enough level of detail that anyone could figure out it's them. So it can be variable, but utilizing the determination of research option from your institution.
I think the other helpful clue is that if you plan to do scholarship, it doesn't matter whether it's program evaluation or research. If you plan to do scholarship, you need IRB approval. It's not up to you to determine what level you're going to receive. It's up to them. And so it's not, you just go to them and say, here's what I'm doing, here's my application. They'll tell you what you need to do.
Most of us have a guy or a gal or a person on the inside of the IRB that we email, right? My person is Janice. And Janice and I, like when she hadn't heard from me for a couple of months, she was so worried about me. And she told me when I wrote her, and she's like, I've been thinking about you. I'm so worried. The pandemic's really hard. You're an emerged doc. Like you should have a bestie at your IRB that will like write you great emails like Janice. And then you can have that, because she will say, like, no, this is program evaluation. No, this is, and she'll give me the official letter that I PDF and I put in the file with the paper. And then when academic medicine wants me to upload my IRB exemption or approval or whatever, I have it ready, right? So that should be one of the check boxes on Jamie's checklist, I assume, that you could replicate, right? Which is that is a step in the stage. And it's also something that I, with my mentees, insist that they do a research protocol or a study protocol, regardless of whether or not it's program evaluation or research, because program evaluation is still scientific work, it's still rigorous. And that way you're ready. If they say, actually, this is like research, we're ready to go. We just submit the next day, pending some signatures.
Because I've had before where I'm like, this is definitely research. It was actually for my thesis, and I got a letter back saying from the IRB that's like, this is not research. And I'm like, but it is. And they're like, not an RS. I'm like, okay.
IRBs are fascinating because it's going to vary distinctly based on your institution. Ultimately, open communication is key. Just ask them. It's actually way less work on their end, too, if you just ask them, because then they don't have to review it. If they're like, hey, no, you're fine. Or they're going to be like, you know what, this actually fit better into this category, and then they don't have to do back and forth with you 3 or 4 times over the awkward whatever management system that they tend to use. But once you do, document, right? So it has to go hand in hand. Some journals, increasing numbers of them, are asking for the IRB to be uploaded into it, so you can actually see proof of that. So communicate and then document.
Sometimes a phone call is just going to save you a lot of time and headache and miscommunication than, you know, back and forth emails or whatnot.
I'll point out that I first met Janice because of many, many emails with the chairs of the IRB and then the manager of the IRB, and I was super annoying in my first year of practice. And they were like, no, all of your stuff is research. I'm like, okay. And then I submitted like 10 IRBs, and they're like, we should talk to you. We don't quite understand your work, because this all probably could fit under program evaluation. I'm like, that's what I was trying to tell you. And then we struck an agreement. And then Janice was basically assigned to me. And since then, Janice has become the most popular person for all the education scientists, because now my mentees have come through Janice, and now she has a whole tribe of people who like love hanging out and emailing her lots of things.
All right, this is going to be the last question.
This isn't a question, it's an answer to your question. Its answer to your question is some places will have an Office of Human Research Protections that the IRB may or may not fall under, but it's still an extra office that really knows their stuff in that, and they can be more of a consulting service if your IRB is unwilling to take on, just curbside consult. So, Office of Human Research Protections is often a good place to go, as is the OHRP website from the Health and Human Services, because they've got algorithms that you can follow and at least get an idea where you're going with it before you actually have to submit something.
Great pearls in there, and just remembering that the website as well will generally guide a lot of that. It may be a little awkward to navigate, but once you navigate, it's just often algorithms because they want to make things where you have to bother them less.
So for those of us who have zero patience and get a really great idea and want to implement it immediately, and have a hard time figuring out how you would want to research or publish it at the very start of a project, and then get to the end and it's like, well, this was really great, now I want to do something about it. How do you guys time that? Do you pause your innovations? Do you think about them beforehand? How do you kind of stage that with research and writing it up?
I think it's still not actually published, but it's online first. But we did a program evaluation for the first time for a program after 8 years of the program existing. And actually, that adds to literature in a very different way than a program that's fresh and was done last year. So I do think that there's role for sometimes letting something sit for a little bit, doing the CQI process, just evaluating for the sake of evaluating it, and not necessarily writing it up immediately, because I think that more mature programs, actually that's probably a paucity of what we have. I think that something that's got a 5-year outcome, 8-year outcome, where you have different strategies that you use, like a realist evaluation to see what ended up happening. It was a leadership program, and so even though it has the same mechanisms over many years, different people came from different contexts, from all different kind of walks of life and different stages of career. So being able to look back at 10, 12 people, some of who had become chairs because they were in the first or second cohort, allowed us to have a more robust program evaluation in the end and actually show how that program actually made impact. And if we had just surveyed people or done something very contrite at the very beginning, we wouldn't have had that richness of the retrospective kind of understanding of how the mechanisms helped and how they met some of their best friends who encouraged them, all that other stuff is harder to get around, right? So it's just something to think about, that there are different kinds of program evaluation that you might apply in other ways. Another one to think about would be the SIP model, which is context, input, process, product, which actually requires you to do some circular revisional kind of work. So to look into some of these other models that you don't have to write right away, but doing some really good note taking, so later you could harvest and figure out how that program actually did end up improving and processing and changing.
The only thing I'll add is just that, when you do decide to do either a program evaluation or or any form of scholarship, I think it really is worth the time, even if you want to jump into everything, but really just be a little bit thoughtful and deliberate about how what outcomes you're looking at, how you're going to collect them. Is everything in alignment, right? To really make sure that you end up with good quality, whatever it is that you're working on, and you're not just trying to mesh together something that's, kind of just half-baked.
And then also looking at your target journal, right, and looking at like what they've published as well will give you some of the like metrics that they use as success, and then also these how-to journal, articles that Teresa and Mike have been part of really kind of give you some of those actual charts that tell you like these are what you should measure, right? These are quality things, so that can help you at the planning phase, because it's hard to go back from the end and then catch that data. You can try really hard, but it gets really challenging, and especially if it's in a survey status, the response rate is really challenging as well. So if you can preemptively kind of have that in place, then it can help you, on the backside not to have a headache and actually push it forward.
All right, with that, thank you to everyone for your sharing your insights. I've worked with them for 6, 7, 8 years now, and I still learn every time. I just kind of get to absorb knowledge in different ways that people approach things. So I've learned a lot moderating this panel, and thank you all for sharing your insights, and thank you all for sharing your insights and questions in this. And with that, we'll pass along to Dr. Stamen.